Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode we'll be looking at high-ranking British prisoners of war held by the Italians and their attempts at escape. It's arguably a story to rival that of the Great Escape or Colditz. But before we get started, this podcast is made possible by the very kind donations of listeners like yourself. The $1 or $2 that patrons of the show contribute helps me to find the time to put this podcast together, purchase research material and pay for the hosting. All so I can produce an hour or two of World War II goodness each month. So if you would like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ww2podcast or ww2podcast.com and click on donate. When you become a patron of the show, you will get access to more World War II talk from time to time. Often parts of my conversations with guests never make it into the show. They might be off topic, for instance. And when I have some gems, I do make these available to patrons. So that's patreon.com/ww2podcast or click on donate at ww2podcast.com. So joining me today is Dr Mark Felton. Mark is the author of numerous military history books, one of which is Castle of Eagles, which was recommended to me by a listener. And what a great book it is. It's not surprising that currently it's been optioned for a feature film with the script being worked upon right now. So Mark, thanks for joining me. I think it will surprise many people to discover the Italians held quite a large number of high-ranking British prisoners of war. So we have Richard O'Connor, Gambia Perry, Phillip Neame, my favourite Adrian Carton de Wiart, John Combe, Air Marshal Boyd. There's a couple of New Zealand brigadiers. But, it must be unusual for such high-ranking officers to be bagged.
It's just the luck of the draw, really. I mean, these guys were in the wrong place at the wrong time and were swept up largely by the Germans, although they end up in Italian camps. One of the issues is some people have raised, why were they prisoners of the Italians when they were captured by Rommel and others? And the reason for that is, of course, that the North African theatre was primarily an Italian theatre commanded from Rome, with Mussolini in charge, although Rommel was doing most of the actual fighting. So I don't know if you remember, there's a part in the book quite early on where the Germans tried to basically kidnap Neame and O'Connor and a few others and fly them off to Berlin. Neame got wind of this, and they were actually planning to hijack the plane because they still had a revolver and a hand grenade and a fairly large amount of guts. They decided to try to hijack the plane to prevent it from being taken to Berlin because their fear was being handed over to the SS or Gestapo for interrogation. However, as you probably know, Neame managed to basically collar an Italian officer and explain to him, look, we're really prisoners of the Italians. You need to put us in an Italian camp. Unfortunately, the Italians stood up for the rights of the British under the Geneva Convention and, killed off the German effort to get them to Berlin.
Every one of them is a great, almost a film within itself, every one of the captures. But I hadn't realised it's Gambia Perry dined with Rommel in the desert?
Yes, this is quite an extraordinary story because Gambia Perry was commander of the 2nd Armoured Division, which was basically fell to pieces. It was, cut to bits by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Terrible mess. And then Gambia Perry was captured along with most of his staff. Rommel did actually come up and meet them. And the famous story is that Gambia Perry was taken to dinner by Rommel in a tent in the desert, and they sort of exchange pleasantries and all this sort of stuff. He comes back out of the tent to find that Gambia Perry's cap, his general's cap, had been taken by some Afrika Korps soldier as a trophy. Rommel basically had kittens on the spot and had the guy brought up and was given a severe bollocking, and the cap was returned. Now, Gambia Perry, being a English gentleman, he thought he had to do something in return, so he handed Rommel a pair of anti-gas goggles, these large clear goggles, which of course Rommel wore on his own cap for the rest of his life. And that cap and Gambia Perry's goggles are now in the Rommel Museum in Germany.
And I thought that was a superb story.
Yeah, absolutely. I never knew they were British goggles.
No, I didn't. I had to go and I didn't disbelieve you, but I had to look up a picture and to just think, wow, that's incredible. What a brilliant, brilliant story.
I think it sort of demonstrates the chivalry of the Desert War, which was very different from other theatres, and Rommel's very correct behaviour and the Germans' very correct behaviour in the desert.
Yeah. And the other, I mean, it might be that I keep coming back to him as he's a personal favourite. The remarkable man to be bagged is Adrian Carton, is it de Wiart?
Yes, I tend to pronounce it de Wiart. Some people say de Wiart, and I think de Wiart sounds a bit better, but so it's multiple pronunciations. But yes, he is a larger than life character, and of course immortalised in fiction by Even in War as Brigadier Ben Ritchie Hook in the Sword of Honour trilogy. You couldn't make this guy up. As far as I could tell through a lot of research, he was made of some sort of reinforced steel. I mean, the guy was indestructible. You don't produce these sorts of characters anymore, I have to say. It's some weird sort of throwback to... I mean, the thing I like, because the other ranks, prisoners at the castle where they were kept, they used to... they nicknamed Carton de Wiart Long John Silver, obviously, because he had a black eye patch and a missing hand. And Flight Lieutenant Leaming, who was Air Vice Marshal Boyd's aide-de-camp, he said, you could imagine him climbing up the side of some old-time merchantman out at sea with a cutlass between his teeth. He was that sort of, hang 'em from the yardarm sort of manner and all this sort of thing. But a great friend of Winston Churchill as well. So,
which is probably why he was still serving age 62.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the guy should have been put out to fodder some time ago, but he was in command of British forces, well, some of them in Norway, of course, the early campaign, but was really too old and too incapacitated by injuries. I mean, he'd been shot and blown up and bits shot off many, many times. And, he has a bit of a hard time because, I mean, at the end of the day, he's got quite poor balance. He has to have a walking stick and, he can't read very well because he's only got one eye and things like this. But he's at the forefront of escaping. And I think, I don't know what he thought he still had to prove. He had a Victoria Cross and, he was known as the unkillable soldier, but he was determined also to become a major escape artist as well. So hats off, I have to say.
I was aware he'd been captured, but I hadn't realised that, his plane goes down and he drags the pilot out, who's younger than him and unconscious, and, as you say, one-handed and various bits and pieces, basically it swims to the shore with the pilot saving his life.
Yeah, absolutely. It was about a mile or so to the North African coast, and apparently, he was questioned later by doctors and people about this air crash. This is the second air crash he'd been in his life, actually. So the second time he'd gone down, he'd been knocked unconscious and everything, and he said, "Well, bloody hell, nothing like a good dunking in cold seawater. No whatever, no concussion." Apparently he was suffering from concussion, but the trouble was he was fairly, boisterous and doolally at the best of times. So you couldn't really tell whether he was cussed or normal. His moustache was fairly fierce and was bristly and fierce, and the whole demeanour was very very interesting, and apparently had the most colourful language in the British Army. So that sort of stuff I had to tone down a bit in the book. Otherwise, it would have sounded more like Platoon or something by the end of it.
Yeah, he's the most wonderful character. So when the Italians handed over all these prisoners, how are you expected to deal with high-ranking officers?
Well, obviously, the Geneva Convention sets things out quite clearly, and we captured quite a few Italian officers as well, and they're expected to be treated somewhat differently from ordinary prisoners. So they're allowed to retain their batmen, for example, their officers' servants. They're normally allocated their own rooms, special exercise, diet, all this sort of thing. And the Italians did everything absolutely correctly, as they should have done, as we we were doing. And, there was always the fear that if some of this was leaked, that they were not treating generals properly, we would take revenge against their own personnel. So, and also with the Germans, we did the same thing. So, yeah, they were given fairly comfortable existences in the castle and in the Villa Orsini, where they were imprisoned the first time. However, it still came as a bit of a shock. You've got to remember that these guys, for example, General O'Connor, Sir Richard O'Connor, he had captured 130,000 Italians, 500 tanks, absolutely clobbered the living daylights out of Mussolini in North Africa, and then he ends up being captured through making a mistake driving in the desert with General Neame at night time. And, these men had taken a massive come down from high-ranking positions with huge responsibilities to basically sitting in a small castle with, 12 of you or 14 of your contemporaries arguing about, how much chocolate you're getting on your Red Cross ration, or demanding walks around the countryside, or, this sort of petty world shrunk to nothing virtually. So escape became a major diversion for them. And also, of course, there was the very honest appraisal that somebody like Sir Richard O'Connor or Sir Phillip Neame, if they were thrown back into service, they were enormously valuable to the British war effort. So those kind of men needed to be back, in the Allied lines.
As you said, there's not very many in the camp, but they've all served in the army in the interwar years, so presumably, and they're all probably of a similar class, they've been at similar social functions, they've no doubt been at postings together. They must have all known one another before they ended up in the camp.
Yes, except for the New Zealanders, the rest of them you are quite correct, they are all from what we would call basically the landed gentry. They are professional army officers. They were all commissioned before the First World War. They'd all served in the First World War, of course. Some of them, in the case of Neame and de Wiart, had both been awarded the Victoria Cross. This is, pretty impressive. I just want to single out Phillip Neame just for a moment, because, this guy is just like an all-action Indiana Jones type hero. He has a Victoria Cross and an Olympic gold medal. He was a big game hunter. He had the claw marks from a Bengal tiger across his chest. He climbed just about every mountain, explored everywhere, and shot every kind of game you can think of. And he took up, as a hobby inside the castle, VC and Olympic champion, he took up needlepoint. And he spent most of his time, when he wasn't trying to escape and helping escapes, making cushion covers. So, and nobody batted an eyelid about this. It's perfectly normal sort of behaviour, apparently. But this is the thing. They are English gentlemen of the first, or I shouldn't say English because a couple of them are Scots, but British gentlemen of the old school. They are fairly straightforward and simple. They are soldiers through and through and have served entire lives in the British Army and the Empire. And they certainly don't have much time for the Italians, who consider, absolutely second rate.
So what is their daily routine? What do presumably the Italians do the Italians have much say in their daily routine, or are they pretty much allowed to get on with what they want to do?
Well, they have roll calls. They have a roll call in the morning and a roll call in the evening. So you have about 14 British officers, plus you have about another 12 or so other ranks prisoners who are there to look after them and do various other menial tasks around the castle. You have a guard of about getting on for 200 Italians guard. So obviously they were frightened, crazy of these elderly British officers, and they did actually get quite worried by them later on, because they were very shocked that British officers who had given their word they would not do this sort of thing started, leaping over walls, digging tunnels and trying to bluff their way out the castle and all sorts of things. These guys were irrepressible, and the poor old Italians, who were terribly proper about everything, they entered into extremely long, drawn-out arguments about points of the Geneva Convention. General Neame or Air Vice Marshal Boyd used to drive them absolutely crazy with this sort of pointless arguing, basically just to wind them up. It was a kind of spectator sport, winding up the Italians. That worked quite well. But the thing was, the Italians were generally shocked that British officers of this rank and age would attempt such what they considered suicidal escape from a castle near Florence. but they underestimated the grit and determination of these men, who really, they were hauling around, huge brass ones, as far as I can tell. And they were happy to keep deploying their superior mental intellects and everything else to solve these problems. But yeah, life in the castle was, it was not unpleasant. They had a suite of public rooms to use, which were well furnished, dining room, smoking room, writing room, all this sort of thing. They had reasonably good rooms with ensuite bathrooms. The castle had been modernized somewhat by an American owner just before the war, so it wasn't too bad. The problem was mostly isolation. They were stuck right next to Florence, and they could see the Duomo and other buildings from their terrace, but they were forbidden any visits to Florence, which drove Major General Gambia Perry round the bend, because he was an artist from a famous artist family, and he was desperate to get down to the Uffizi and have a look. And there were lots of complaints I came across in the Red Cross files from General Neame, basically saying that, we're being denied intellectual stimulation. And we're left to moulder away here in this castle, whilst Italian generals held in India are taken out to watch polo matches and things like this. And it is quite true. Mussolini was paranoid that they might get away, and he was holding them as prize prisoners, basically as basically hostages.
I did find the whole argument, trying to justify escape attempts through their mistreatment, hugely amusing, considering the life of luxury they were leading in during wartime.
I wouldn't say it's luxurious. I think they were missing a lot of things. I mean, they were reliant quite a lot on Red Cross food parcels getting through for any kind of luxuries. They had some pretty ingenious other ranks prisoners, particularly the cooks and others, who were able to do amazing things with spam and spaghetti and stuff. And in fact, one of them had been he'd been a cook at Claridge's before the war, so he was Brigadier Todd Hunch. He's a very odd-looking soldier, but we forgive anything, because he was a cook at Claridge's, so that's fine. But other than that, I mean, they were bored silly. I mean, these were men of action and high command, and it ended up with basically playing cards and things like this, and arguing the toss about which is better, the Army or the Royal Air Force, and replaying old battles and things like this. And I think they needed escape, and they needed to be doing something to keep their mental state well. And I think that would have been the same for any age of men put into that situation. If you put in 14 officers in their 20s and 30s, they would have been driven mad by the situation as well, and would have tried to escape, I'm sure.
They possibly, what I thought the classic encapsulation of how well they were treated was when Leaming is being, Boyd's ADC is being, he's sent to the castle first, isn't he? The Italians treat him to dinner, and his escape attempt there. I mean, do you want to tell us about that? Because that's wonderful how much freedom they seem to give them in that respect.
Oh yes,
does that make?
Yes, I think you're referring to when they were travelling. It was the advance party, which was Flight Lieutenant Leaming and a couple of sergeants and a corporal. And they were sent ahead to the castle from the Villa Orsini, which is in the Abruzzo region, up to Florence. So they go by train with a small escort of Italian guards and a rather useless Italian second lieutenant. And as they came into, I think it was Milan. I'm not sure now, but I think it was Milan. I wrote the book some time ago, so I try to remember everything. Anyway, they came into a major train station, we'll call it that at the moment. Rome, that was it, Rome, of course. So the officer and the senior NCO in charge of the guard, they had made arrangements to go and visit their fiancées in Rome. So they knew that if they left privates in charge of these people, that the privates would simply disappear and go and enjoy themselves. So they locked up Leaming and the other ranks in the station ticket office with the ticket clerks to look after them. And of course, Leaming asked to use the toilet. So the idea was to make some kind of blitz escape attempt, quick escape attempt. He goes into the loo, goes into a stall, climbs up, opens a window, and he's just about to climb out. And he sees below him 2 Italian workmen having their lunch, so he can't escape. And he was planning a very, very simple escape. Because they were in Rome, they were within a couple of miles of Vatican City, which is, of course, neutral and has a British embassy. So he was simply going to take off his RAF tunic, roll it up under his arm, and just walk through Rome. He'd memorized through talking to Italian soldiers the basic route, head towards Vatican City to St. Peter's and turn up there and take shelter. And it would have worked, I'm sure, but no, it doesn't work. So they end up actually arriving at the castle. And of course they're greeted by, it seems okay, because although the castle's a bit forbidding and rather Gothic and a bit of a mess, to tell you the truth, the commandant is a guy called the Duke of Montalto. He's a colonel in the Italian army. And hilariously, he had been to the same public school as General Neame. So the idea, the Italians thought, hang on, we've got a British prisoners, gentlemen, so let's put Italian officers in charge who know something about the British. And of course, the commandant's wife was also British as well. So it was all sort of very pleasant and everything else. But of course, they didn't realise that putting extremely pro-British officers in charge of other British prisoners doesn't actually do a lot of good, because eventually the Duke of Montalto was removed from command because he attended a Christmas dinner with the British officers, and at the end General Neame proposed a toast to the King, and it wasn't King Umberto of Italy, it was the King George. Poor old the commandant, the Duke of Montalto, felt sort of duty bound. He didn't want to cause offence, so he also toasted the King, and this was spotted by a couple of rather fascist orientated Italian orderlies, which reported down the line, and he was removed and sent to Libya, to the front, where hilariously he was captured by the British and made a prisoner of war. So around it goes. But after that, they decided to put in the exact opposite of people like Montalto. They put in rather unpleasant fascist officers, acolytes of Mussolini, and the whole situation became a bit darker.
So when they arrived from, what is... is it saying light? I was going to say lightly guarded, but they were, the villa was, but had much more potential for escape necessarily, and they held off escaping from the villa because their new accommodation was going to be 200 miles closer to the Swiss border. How did they feel when they saw the castle? I mean, was there much opportunity for escape? Because it's a proper castle, isn't it?
It is. It's a very substantial fortress. It dates back to about the 11th century on a hill above Florence, but it was extensively rebuilt from a ruin into a fully functioning castle again in the 19th century by a British owner, of all people. In the late 19th century, this guy called John Temple Leader, who was an MP, he bought it, and his speciality was doing up buildings around Florence, and to basically house his art collection. And he spent a huge sum of money really building an incredibly strong structure. And of course, it was the perfect prison to be used 50-odd years later by the Italian government. So, yes, absolutely, you're quite right. General Dwyer and others and O'Connor are horrified to be put into this place because it is very difficult to get out of. And of course, they begin to test the defences quite early on with a series of increasingly hair-raising escapes, which unfortunately, fail. But it is. It was on a par with Colditz. It's not quite the same look as Colditz or the size, but it's a very, very substantial medieval castle with 30-foot high, 6-foot thick walls, crenellated battlements, towers, and they live in the central keep in the middle with a series of rooms going down to a sort of underground area as well. And there are lots of walled-off passages and walled-off rooms, and it's a real kind of Alice in Wonderland sort of place.
It's O'Connor who makes the first, obviously, hair-raising attempt, but it's actually involving rabbits, not hares. But his attempt's the first, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, there was an idea that they could, because they were allowed to keep rabbits, they could breed rabbits, which they never actually managed to breed any rabbits, which was extraordinary considering rabbits, what they do. So for some reason, totally incapable of breeding rabbits, but the idea was that they would be for the pot, along with hens that they were raising both for eggs and also for meat as well. So, yeah, they had hutches, and Air Vice Marshal Boyd and Lieutenant the Earl of Ranfully, who is one of the ADCs, Dan Ranfully, both younger officers, they were doing a bit of carpentering on the side, and as well as building stuff for escapes, they built rabbit hutches. So the idea was they would stack up all the rabbit hutches in front of the wall in a particularly sort of good area, and then they would basically knock a hole in the wall behind the rabbit hutches, and nobody would spot this. And they were working away doing this sort of thing. And unfortunately, it was basically a much more competent Italian officer was put in charge of some of the camps in the region. And he was highly suspicious of any sort of funny behavior. And he spotted these hutches and told them, remove those, because they're obviously a security threat to the integrity of the wall. So that was one idea. And there are other ideas, and I expect you're going to talk about Richard O'Connor's daring attempt to leap over the wall, which was fairly insane, but actually worked. Yeah.
Well, it sort of worked to a point, didn't it?
Yeah, to a point, yeah. He got captured, but it worked. In theory, it worked. And I mean, the idea of basically standing, because the wall is very, very high, you have a guard platform above, and the guards are walking around, and the prisoners had a kind of a recreation area set down below. So they wouldn't be able to reach the platform without being boosted up. So the idea was he would wait until the guard was being changed, which happened several times a day. And of course, they would march from one end of the guard platform all the way around the other, relieving each of the sentries. So they'd basically be busy. They'd have their backs to a certain spot. So the intention was that he would be boosted up onto the guard's platform as they marched past. He would then run over to where the battlements have these kind of window boxes, if you like, placed with flowers in. And there was a gap where one of them had not been replaced. It had been broken at some point. And he had a wedge of wood shaped to fit this particular battlement, so he could lodge it inside with a coil of rope and then leap over the side and basically abseil down the 30 foot on the other side. Remember, this is a 55-year-old man we're talking about. And then run off into the dense foliage at the bottom of the castle wall. And it worked really well. Unfortunately, he only had 7 seconds, I think, in order to actually achieve this without being spotted by the fresh guards as they do there. So it's a bit complicated to explain. But all that was seen, a guard out of the corner of his eye saw a flash of something, probably an arm or a leg or something, because O'Connor found it a little bit more time consuming doing it for real than they had done for practice in their rooms, trying to get this thing into place, and he was spotted. Anyway, the guard leaned out, and there he sees this general with a white moustache and a backpack on, going like the clappers down this homemade rope. And the next thing O'Connor hears is a rifle being recycled and pointed at him, and he was told to halt in no uncertain terms. 5 minutes later, the guards come out mob-handed. They get him at the bottom, and he's hauled off for his obligatory 30-day solitary confinement. But a brave attempt, I have to say, and one that came very, very close to succeeding.
Well, simpler ones possibly are the ones that sort of do quite well. Something that amused me as well, I have visions of hardened criminals when they're planning heists and such things, not producing any paperwork, they're not producing an evidence trail, which, these are, staff officers sort of level, people seem to produce paperwork which can then be found.
Yes, this is extraordinary. They were actually, for some reason, writing down a lot of the things they were doing, and they were planning things out with pen and paper, as you said, and then leaving it in their rooms. This sort of stuff could be found because every so often the Italians would launch these spot searches. So there are a couple of occasions where they have to think very, very quickly on their feet and try to hide things by fooling the Italians whilst they're searching. So it's very, very tense, that sort of thing. And some documentation is found which reveals various proposed escape attempts and whatever. And again, this horrifies the Italians. Very interestingly, the local Italian military commander for the Florence region is sent up to give them a bollocking. They're all put on parade, and this Italian general tells them off, and he says, this is terribly ungentlemanly behaviour, disgusted, stop this sort of thing, escape is impossible, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of his speech, which I rather like, he actually said, however, if I was in the same situation, I'd do exactly the same thing. So can we all go and have a glass of wine together? And this is what happened. And, the trouble was, obviously somebody was taking notes, because that particular Italian general, who was a guy called General Chiappe, he was shot by the Germans in 1943 after they took over Italy. So obviously somebody was taking names for officers who were not being hard enough on these sorts of people. And I think very much his leniency towards these British generals led to his own untimely death, unfortunately.
Yeah. So their main focus becomes on the chapel. Where is the chapel? It's not within their immediate compound, is it?
Well, it is. It's bricked up and sealed up, and it's easy for them to walk past it, and they're right beside it on a daily basis. But it's also overlooked by the guards, so you couldn't do anything funny with the doors because you would be spotted. So they had religious services every Sunday. Gambia Perry used to take those services, and he also ran the choir as well. He's very interested in music and all this sort of stuff. However, they were not allowed to use the chapel, and the Italians had never used it either. So eventually General Dwyer came up with the idea, why don't we try to investigate the chapel? So one very quiet day, when sort of around lunchtime, when there's very few guards around, they managed to have a peek through a kind of air vent above the main door. And General Neame, using his engineer's eye, was able to spot inside and get a rough idea of the dimensions of the chapel and the entrance. And they found that there was the entrance was a sort of sunken entrance lower down, which was outside of the main massive walls of the keep, so they wouldn't have to cut their way through all of that. It would be a bit less of a job. So actually gaining access to it was done through a lift shaft, which ran between the prisoners' dining areas and the kitchens, and also the bricked up chapel. So there was a kind of dumb waiter arrangement which had been put in by temple leader. And so they used that as cover. So they removed the lights at the top of the shaft. The electricians came in and did various things. They were able to jam the lift so it wasn't able to be moved very easily. So if any Italian looked up, they would just see the bottom of the lift sticking up rather than anybody working on the top. So they stood on the top of the lift, cut a hole into the chapel like that, and were able to access it as many times as they liked without being seen by the guards outside. And then the chapel itself, they sank the tunnel in the foyer of the chapel, which, as I mentioned, was outside of the keep's wall, which was less to cut through, and then worked their way across underground towards the curtain wall of the main castle itself, and dumping, many tons of spoil inside the chapel itself, which was basically piled high with soil and rock. But it's a big job, a serious piece of civil engineering.
It's incredible that the Italians never ever did any spot checks on the chapel, because, as you said, there must have been tons and tons and tons of soil just heaped.
There was, and it's about 10 tons, I think it was. And at the end of the day, it's a building they thought was completely secure. It was completely cut off from the other parts of the castle and fully under lock and key, and of course overlooked by guards. But this was the brilliance of having a very well-organised lookout system in place, which Carton de Wiart ran because he couldn't dig, obviously, with one arm. But he managed to run this using both the orderlies and some of the other generals and brigadiers and everybody. And the electrician, one of the sergeants was an electrician, and he managed to install a buzzer system, so they could have a signal worked out for, different guard movements or whatever, and they could just buzz down to the tunnel, which was very ingenious.
Well, that was going to be one question I do have here. These guys had military backgrounds. They're not necessarily engineers and mining experiences, and presumably in some of the larger prisoners of war camps for regulars, when you need someone, you can probably find someone who's done that in a past life. When it comes to things like the tunnelling, how did they get on, or even the the escape kit? Is there a Donald Pleasance type character among them to act as a master forger? Did someone have to take up that role and basically learn the skills?
That's right. So you have a series of men who are not really suitable for what they're doing. It is true, however, Neame is in the Royal Engineers and he has tunnelling experience from World War One. He has a brilliant mathematical ability and everything else with handmade instruments able to measure everything out to the last inch and build this, basically. So he supervises the construction of the tunnel. Other ones have more important jobs. For example, Gambia Perry is the forger, and his job is to produce not only maps, but also all the Italian ID documents that they're going to need in order to get out. And one of the problems was getting photographs, because obviously they're denied cameras. So how do you do this? And the incredible thing was the Italians were happy for them to have records delivered for their gramophones. And they love classical music. They used to have classical music days where they'd listen to it all together and all this. And Gambia Perry actually noticed that on the back of many of the LP covers, they have photographs of the musicians who are actually playing, and they're often black and white, glossy sort of photos. And they realized, well, what they should do is try to find musicians who look like the prisoners and then cut them out and use them on the IDs. And this is what they did. So it was really, really good. The only one they couldn't do was de Wiart, because he was strange looking, obviously. So they had to, I think they used the dictator of Romania, I think from a, I think it was Antonescu, Ion Antonescu, I think it was, who was the fascist dictator of one of these Eastern European countries, and he fitted the bill fine for that. The use of wood, for example, Boyd and also Dan Ranfully, they're both working as carpenters, so they're very, very good at building revetments and rather ingenious covers for the escape places, both ends of it, and all that sort of stuff. Making of clothes, this was quite difficult. They had some help from other ranks prisoners, but they were basically making sort of workman's flat caps and very simple jackets and things out of bedding and things like this. So enough to look respectably Italian workman-like. So that's all they needed to look basic. And the other advantage they had, of course, if they could fool the guards long enough, if they could get a head start without their IDs going out, I don't think anybody would be looking for men between the ages of 49, 50 and 63. They're not of military age, so they can blend into the population quite well.
Well, that sort of fits, six are to go out, that sort of fits really with their plan. It hadn't directly occurred to me that from their age point of view, they're inconspicuous within the civil population once they go through the tunnel. With the exception, of course, of Carton de Wiart, who must stand out like a sore thumb if you put a wanted poster up.
He's dressed rather unconvincingly as Italian peasant. So you've got this guy who's 6'1", black eye patch, no hand on one left hand missing, I think it was, with a walking stick, and he doesn't quite look the part, I have to say. Now that is probably why his best friend in the camp, Richard O'Connor, who was the major leading escape artist, he volunteered, instead of taking the trains to try to get up to the Swiss border, de Wiart and O'Connor would simply try to march, which was 200 odd miles. And they would be marching about 30 miles a day, carrying, 25 pounds of equipment, living rough, sleeping in cow sheds and under carts and all sorts of things, and basically throwing themselves on the mercy of the local population. They were going to try to pretend to be two elderly Austrian tourists on a walking holiday during wartime of northern Italy. But it worked for quite a few days. The other four, travelling in two pairs, they decide to go by train. So that's actually quite dangerous because they have to go to train stations, they have to buy tickets, they have to interact with the Italians and things like this. So that's a fairly stressful escape as well. The other thing is one of the most ingenious things, which, I couldn't believe it when I came across this because I really like the Clint Eastwood film, Escape from Alcatraz. They made dummy heads of the six escapers, and they placed them in their bed. So when the Italian officer came to do his nighttime check, which was about 2 o'clock in the morning, he would flash his torch into the room, and beneath the mosquito nets, he would notice that these six generals are still where they're supposed to be. So that gave them a massive head start. And then General Neame was also able to bluff a very young Italian second lieutenant who came to do the count in the morning. They didn't line them all up. He would simply come in, have a chat, have a cup of Bovril with the generals and sort of randomly count them. He didn't do his job properly, and they were able to fool this Italian officer by repeatedly entering the room wearing different bits of uniform and hats and things like this. So the remaining prisoners confused this poor Italian officer, and he reported that all prisoners were present and correct. So they ended up with over, I think, 20-odd hours head start, which managed to get them, the ones on the train anyway, certainly most of the way to the Swiss frontier.
It's remarkable that they could carry it off for that so long. It goes to reinforce this sort of idea of how the Italians were sort of almost tiptoeing round them to get through with that bluster. I found it quite sad because only the two New Zealanders managed to get across the border, didn't they?
Yeah, so what you have is a series of these very exciting moments where people are getting captured or spotted, and one of the first ones, unfortunately, is Brigadier John Coombe. He is clocked by some kind of plainclothes Italian police officer in one of the stations, if I remember, in Milan, and he takes one for the team. He allows himself to be arrested and led off. To the other three in the party are not recaptured. They make themselves scarce and are able to carry on their journey. And Coombe, he was not identified as a British officer at that time. He was suspected because of his dodgy Italian, blonde hair, and collection of strange maps that he had with him as some kind of cross-border smuggler. Which they had a lot of problem with this, and he was taken off and very severely interrogated for several days, held in a prison, and he was threatened with execution by the Italians, and he held out for, if I remember, about 3 days before he actually revealed that he was indeed a British brigadier, and gave them a head start to try to get up there. And then, of course, Air Vice Marshal Boyd, the most tragic case I find, he was split up. He was split up from the two New Zealand brigadiers, Brigadier Miles and
Hargrest.
Yes, Hargrest. So those two are travelling together, and they're taking trains closer and closer to the border in Switzerland. And Boyd was split up from them, unfortunately, and had to go out on his own. And he decided to, in true Wild West fashion, to basically ride the rails. So he was going to try to jump a train as it went across the border, and he noticed by watching the trains as they crossed the Swiss border at a place called Chiasso that the trains were not stopped. They tended to kind of come to a stop about a mile or so from the border, and then they would shunt themselves across into Switzerland. So he thought, well, I'll just get into one of these goods trains. And so he made it to a goods train. He got inside one, and he thought, that's it, fantastic. And of course it shunts forward right up to the border, and then everything goes quiet. He hears some clunking and clicking and shouting and everything else, and then he hears the train continuing across the border. But unfortunately, the last two carriages, in which he was in the last one, were left hiding, and he was literally within a stone's throw of the Swiss border. So he thought, what the hell do I do now? I mean, he thought, well, it was the middle of the night. Maybe I'll try to sort of sneak across. So he gets out of the carriage, but unfortunately by that stage the Italians, the alarm had gone up. They were looking for these generals, and he was recaptured. But how disheartening. I mean, literally he could see the lights on the other side, of the border. He could see it all lit up and everything else. And then you have the two New Zealand brigadiers who decide to go by foot. They go up into the mountains around Chiasso and try to work their way across the border, and they don't really know quite where they are, and they have various adventures until they come across this ruddy great fence in the snow. And, think, well, blimey, this must be it. And so it's very exciting stuff.
The sad thing about the two New Zealanders is they're the two that sort of get out on this run, but neither of them survive the war, which is sad, really. It's
very, very sad because, these two fantastic New Zealand officers go through so much, and they do make it to Switzerland after many, many thrilling and exciting adventures. And from Switzerland, of course, you're still stuck in the middle of enemy territory. So the only way to get back into the war is to get to neutral Spain, and the only way to do that was to risk going down an escape line through German-occupied France. And I've written a previous book called Zero Night, which dealt with these kind of escape lines through escape of another camp. And these men and women, a lot of them women, I have to say, were incredibly brave. They were risking execution at the hands of the Germans by helping people to escape. And they went separately. Brigadier Reginald Miles went first to Spain. He arrived in Spain, in northern Spain, intact, and then committed suicide. So we are unsure what exactly went on there. That is still rather an open book, whether he did indeed commit suicide, whether he was murdered or whatever. And the other one, Brigadier Hargest, who was an MP, funnily enough. He was one of the few MPs captured during World War II, a serving MP till 1944 in New Zealand. He managed to get himself down to Spain intact, and then back to the UK. He goes over on D-Day as New Zealand's representative in the D-Day landings. He serves in France for several weeks, and on his last day, as he was being evacuated out, service at an end, he was killed by a German shell, which is a terrible, terrible waste. And sadly, unfortunately, his son had also been killed fighting in Italy slightly earlier on, which he had known, which had been appalling. And then the other generals, of course, are still in the castle till 1943. So
it's a fantastic story. Is it difficult? Was it difficult to research?
No, it wasn't. Funnily enough, I thought it would be fairly alarming, but I actually went looking for this story. Because of my love of the Colditz story and castles and things like this, and I think there's something sort of romantic about the whole idea of being banged up in a castle rather than your usual Great Escape type, wooden POW camp. So I thought, well, I will find another story to rival the Colditz story. There must be one, and indeed, I mean, castles are used all the time by the Germans and Italians. So it had to be that right combination. And I started to discover references to people like Neame and O'Connor and de Wiart being held in this one place. And the more I dug into it, the more I found a story which I could not believe had not been told in 70 years. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And I have all of the material, of course, from the various archives and regimental archives, national archives and Imperial War Museum and all this sort of thing. But I also had a wonderful resource in the relatives of the generals themselves. And I met with or interviewed quite a few of them. They gave me a lot of material which had never seen the light of day. And I mean, I remember my real eureka moment, which I couldn't believe. I went up to London to interview Brigadier Todhunter's son, Michael. We're having a very nice chat and all this, and he suddenly pulls out this old photo album. He said, "You might be interested in this." And opened it up, and there it was on every page were photographs taken either during the war or shortly after the war of both the Villa Orsini and Vinciliata Castle. With his father and all the other generals. You see them all stood there, Carton de Wiart and everybody else. And there's Mickey, the big white dog, which was Lieutenant Ricciardi's dog. And you got all the characters there. You got Colonel Mazzawati, the first rather fat and useless Italian commandant of the Orsini camp. And it's wonderful. And none of this stuff had been used or published pretty much ever. So these kind of resources are incredible. And I was also handed all of Todhunter's letters, which he wrote in the castle. And you could see where the Italian censor had blacked out certain things. And you could see where they'd been stamped by the Italian authorities. And there was even amongst the papers, there was one of Gambia Perry's forged ID Italian passport things there as well, which was incredible. So none of this stuff had been seen or used before. So, and the same with many of the other relatives. They were able to give me huge sums of bits and pieces which I had never thought would have existed still. General O'Connor and General Neame both kept extensive private papers. O'Connor, I mean, it was incredible. I actually found O'Connor's last aide-de-camp, who was still alive, a guy called Major Nairn, who's about 94 years old. We chat on the phone and he sends me letters, I send him letters, and he's a wonderful man, really a real classic old school gentleman who was on the D-Day landings himself. And he knew O'Connor intimately, was a great friend of his, and basically is now keeper of the family flame, if you like, because O'Connor's family are all around, and I had a lot of dealings with them. But you had, a professional military man basically taking care of all these military papers, and they include incredibly hand-drawn schematics of the castle. Neame and O'Connor had done, planning all their escapes. And the one we were talking about earlier, which was, the one about the wall, I've got at home the actual hand-drawn schematics, the side drawings of the wall and the measurements and how they're going to get from here to here and how much rope they need for this. And I couldn't put all this stuff into the book, unfortunately. Maybe I should put it onto a website, I think. But it's absolutely extraordinary material. And I was talking to... I had the screenwriter up here the other day who's working on the film, and I was showing him all this material, and we were discussing it, and it was basically, you can imagine it's a set designer's dream. I mean, you've got everything. It's all there with measurements and personal handful notes and everything else. Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic.
And a number of them written biographies as well, hadn't they?
Yes. Yeah. So you had Flight Lieutenant Leaming was a very interesting character because he was a novelist as well. And he was the guy who basically created Ringway Airport in Manchester as well. He had one of his storybook ideas was bought by Walt Disney, and I think was actually made into a children's thing as well. So he was a pretty larger than life character. He died in 1965. However, he left a couple of really fantastically humorous memoirs about this entire situation. And I was able to quote some of this in the book. I mean, you've got some wonderful moments. For example, I mean, the moment, the trial of the machine gun, for example, in the village, which is an absolute classic. The Italians, they're all puffed up and they think they're wonderful. And Rome sends them this brand new great big machine gun, this Breda machine gun in a wooden crate. And at that time, the prisoners in the Villa Orsini only consisted of Boyd, Leaming, and 3 other ranks, sergeants from the RAF. They were guarded by about 50 Italians. And the commandant, he realized that none of his men knew how to put the machine gun together. That was the problem. So he eventually came cap in hand to Boyd. You can imagine this hilarious scene where the commandant asked the prisoners, would you, by any chance, if you're free, next Tuesday, have any time to put the machine gun together for us? That'd be much, much appreciated. And of course, Boyd makes a big show of, oh, absolutely, old boy, no problem at all. We have an armourer. In fact, one of the sergeants is an armourer who will do this for you. So he puts the machine gun together, and as he's walking away, the Italians are all clapping, and they're very, very happy with this. Their lovely new toy. And he walks over to Boyd, who stood in the corner of the courtyard, and he opens his palm up, and he's got a couple of springs in his hand. And Air Vice Marshal Boyd says, good man, lose them. So the thing was, if they ever fire that machine gun, it simply wouldn't work, which is... this is classic.
It's those little touches that you get. I'm guessing came from the biographies of that just make the whole thing such a great read.
Absolutely, yeah. Some of the biographies, some from letters and things, and you do have the personality of the men coming across. Neame himself wrote some things about this, but I also have all his private papers which were not published, and they didn't end up in form, and there's a lot more stuff in there, I have to say, and also with O'Connor I have his private papers as well, which really add to it. De Wiart, although he wrote about it in a very famous biography with The Ford was by Winston Churchill, he burned all his papers shortly before he died, so God knows all the fantastic stuff that disappeared there. Gambia Perry, I had another problem also with that because I was talking to his daughter, and unfortunately she told me that I think the house had been burgled in the 1970s and a lot of stuff had been destroyed or lost. And so, you have some families like the Todd Hunters who have a lot of stuff, and others had lost a lot of things. And of course, the unfortunate point was everybody involved was now dead because, the last one was... General O'Connor, and he died in about 1980, and he's well in his 90s. But so it was relying somewhat on some memories as well that children and grandchildren had. But an enormous amount of material around. There is huge piles of this stuff in archives, just waiting to be used. I mean, the Red Cross kept huge amounts of reports, which I have, running to hundreds of pages, and also Phillip Neame's somewhat acerbic notes to the protecting power, complaining about this, that, and the other. He was known as Green Ink in the army because he always wrote in green ink. And in fact, they are in fact in green ink, all of these notes and things. So that gave a lovely. It's nice to handle the original stuff, to feel the sort of the period is there. It's very interesting.
Yeah, indeed. And it's been optioned for a film. You've had it optioned for a film. How far along is that? Are we?
Oh, well, this was the second one of my books which has been optioned to Hollywood. So the first one was Zero Night in 2015. So I'm in a rather weird position of having two escape dramas being made at the same time. They're in different stages of development, but I'm sort of liaising on both as a kind of historical advisor, and I get to read scripts and things like this. So it's very interesting from a kind of minimal input perspective. As a massive film fan, this is quite exciting. But the Castle of the Eagles one, that was optioned when it was really not written. I have to say, it was only a 30-page outline plus a couple of chapters, chapter 1 and 2. And it was optioned straight away by Entertainment One, which had made recently things like The Woman in Black. They had made, Eye in the Sky, which was a big film recently. And Sweet Française, which was quite a good war film that was made quite recently.
Presumably there's no, as with films, what happens is they are in development forever and then nothing happens, and then it's like moving house. Suddenly it's happening. So presumably there's no dates for the camera to turn over.
Not at this time. We are currently awaiting the first draft of the script. The screenwriter is Jeff Pope, who is probably the most famous screenwriter in Britain today. He wrote Philomena, for which he received an Academy Award nomination and also a BAFTA Award. He's won 3 BAFTA Awards for, his incredible TV stuff like Scylla, Pierre Point, which was another film. And I can't name names, but I can tell you that several incredibly famous British actors, it wouldn't take you too long to guess them, male actors of a certain age in their 50s, have read it and are very interested in playing roles. So I can imagine myself the kind of Ocean's 11 sort of ensemble cast of people playing these major British characters should be very interesting.
Oh, it has such potential to be a great either TV or even a mini series would be.
Absolutely.
There's so much in there. There really is.
Yeah. Well, I've been assured several times that by the producers when I've had meetings with them that this one is going forward, because I think it's such a good story. It's such an interesting story. It's such a different story from what we're used to. And I can imagine it would give a lot of actors in their 50s and 60s who would like to play an action hero, one last time. So if Harrison Ford is listening or somebody like that, this is your chance.
The problem is then you'd have to write in an American...
we can make him a Canadian. How about that?
New Zealander.
New Zealander, absolutely. And I've got a dream cast already in my head. I already see Sam Neill or somebody as one of the New Zealanders. And the kind of talent you had in Valkyrie, for example, those German generals was very, very good. So yeah, it's very exciting, and I do post updates on my website when things come up. But it's an ongoing process, so it's a case of watch this space. But as I said, I have great confidence. You are quite right. The whole process is very slow. And you have to have a lot of patience, so I tend not to try to think about it. I'm already 2 books down the line from Castle of the Eagles now, so I've just finished one called Ghost Riders, which comes out in 2018, and I'm just about to start a new book as well, which is an escape drama set in the Holocaust, which is pretty exciting as well, so more daring do and scary stuff.
Is that escaping from a concentration camp?
Yes, although it does involve Allied soldiers, so it's a bit different from the usual Holocaust story. But the one I've just completed, Ghost Riders, which is a raid behind enemy lines by the Americans. So that's a really thrilling and exciting story. I mean, all my books now since Zero Night have been this sort of, you read it, you think you're reading a novel. That's the idea. So I don't want you to feel you're reading a history book, but it is a book and everything happened as it happened. I just try to give it a bit more immediacy to keep the audience's attention. And I want you to feel that kind of roller coaster ride you get in movies as well, which I think has worked out quite well. I'm very pleased with Castle of the Eagles. I think it's turned out as I wanted it to. So,
it's great because at no point do you feel that you're Well, no, I have to say, at certain times you think he must be invented it, and then you look it up or you check a footnote or something, and you think, oh my good grief! And it is the classic truth is stranger than fiction.
It is, and I mean, what I'm trying to do is with all of my books, with Zero Night, with the Sea Devils, with Castle of the Eagles and Ghost Riders, I'm trying to find stories which already are filmic, if you like. They already have those kind of points in them, if you like. So the structure is in place to make a really exciting thriller type story. So, and incredibly, there are stories like the Castle of the Eagles story, which have not been told properly. They have lain in dusty archives for 70 years, completely forgotten. But they are new, fresh things. I have no interest, for example, in writing another book about the Dam Busters or the Great Escape or whatever. I mean, or Cockleshell Heroes. These things have been done, I think, and far better than I can do them. So I really want to. I tell you, the thing is, you see, I'm a great fan. I'm 43, but I grew up with grandfathers who were combat veterans telling me stories of World War II. I used to like rainy Sunday afternoons watching black and white war films when I got a chance and things like this, and all that John Mills stuff and everything else, Kenneth More, stuck in my head. And I like very much, I want to bring back into the world of history those kind of stories, those kind of thrilling, daring do stories, which have sort of disappeared, I have to say. The Great Escape, the Cockleshell Heroes I mentioned, those sorts of things which really fired me up for my love of history and military history in particular when I was a kid. I think we need more of that now. We're just short of people pulling them out because invariably, and something I'm trying to avoid is endlessly talking about D-Day or Arnhem, or it's the same stuff now. It's almost that define the war, and there is so many more fantastic stories of daring do, of grit, that are just incredible. That almost are slipping from people wanting to talk about them. Although the big histories have their place and they're very important and everything, and hats off to those that do them very well, like Anthony Beevor and others. I think also there is the human story element that has to be told, and I think these kind of raids and escapes dramas, they capture something in the imagination, because we often think, how would we react in that situation? How would we carry on? And we can empathise completely with all their trials and tribulations. And they are very, very exciting. I mean, the thing is, World War II is really exciting, I think. It's the subject that keeps on giving. There are so many thrilling stories that remain untouched. And my job as a historian, I think, is to try to unearth them, give these men back their voices, give them back to the general public today and say, look, that's what that generation did. That's why they are the greatest generation. And one biography that I think is missing is a good look at O'Connor, because I tend to think he's a man that gets overlooked. Absolutely, you're quite right. And that, there were a couple of good biographies in the 70s, but since then, nobody knows his name. Unless you are a hardcore military historian, everybody knows Monty, everybody knows Rommel, but O'Connor was the absolute desert hero, and it is a terrible shame that he's been so forgotten to history. So hopefully, this book will give that back a little bit, because he's overlooked, and everything pre-Monty is kind of sidelined or looked down upon in the desert. Absolutely. And I think also, for example, de Wiart, there is a new biography coming out about him, which is fantastic. So that covers the whole life from birth to death. That would be very interesting to read. And there is also for example, in New Zealand, there, Hargest is a fairly large character in military history and unfairly maligned over the Crete campaign. And there is a big biography coming out on James Hargest as well. So that should be very interesting. So people are looking towards these people. I think General Neame also needs to be looked at again. I mean, he's a very interesting character, but there it is. I mean, it's, I think hopefully if my book gets people thinking about these people and perhaps investigating a bit more, because I mean, I don't obviously cover a blow-by-blow account of the Desert Campaign. I just cover them being captured and things. And hopefully people will go back and look in more detail, because they have incredible stories. And the other thing I always find, my own life as a writer, I get a lot of letters or emails from people who have direct connections to the things I write about. Their fathers or grandfathers were involved, and they are interested. And another thing that really winds me up, I don't know if it happens to you, you get a lot of people say comments about how the younger generation are not interested in things. I'm talking about kids in their 20s. And then you look at the kind of computer games they're playing. They're all historically World of Tanks, or this new World War II thing that's coming out, for example, for the Xbox and all that. I mean, a lot of guys are going to be looking at that, and they want to find out more information through the internet, through what you do, through what I do, and things like this. And I don't think, I find a lot of them are extremely knowledgeable about the weapons, about the battles.
They have a very different gateway drug.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Well, with that, I think that's a good place to finish. Thanks, Mark. Mark's book, Castle of Eagles, is possibly the fastest book I've read this year. I found it unputdownable. I'll put a link on the website. You can find Mark at markfelton.co.uk. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed the podcast, you can support the show at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And I already know there will be more of Mark and I chatting for those patrons of the show. So that's it for this time out. I think the next 2 episodes we'll be looking at the airborne. The first looking at the psychological effects of German airborne on Britain at the start of the war. And the episode after that looking at Operation Tonga, the British airborne element to the D-Day landings. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.